In this video, we'll talk a bit about neurotransmitters. So the brain is an electrochemical system. Chemicals are a major player in information processing. We know this because just about every single drug, which are chemicals, affects the nervous system and affects the brain. It alters brain chemistry and synaptic transmission. Neurons release endogenous chemicals called neurotransmitters, and endogenous here means that it's internally generated from the body. This is compared with exogenous chemicals, which just means it came from outside of the body. So there are some basic rules to being a neurotransmitter, and they are that it must exist in the presynaptic axon terminals, because after all, neurotransmitters are released out into the synapse. It must be released in substantial quantities when an action potential reaches the terminal. And then finally, there must be receptors on the postsynaptic membrane that are able to recognize that particular substance. So it should be able to be released and have an effect on the receiving neuron. Okay, so here's a breakdown of the major neurotransmitters for your notes. They are broken down into a few categories. There are amines, which are broken down into quaternary amines and monoamines. Monoamines contain catecholamines and indoleamines. I know these terms sound very similar. Then there are amino acids and neuropeptides. With neuropeptides, a category often made is opioid peptides versus other types. And surprisingly, there are a couple of gases that are actually considered to be neurotransmitters as well. And then on the right, you see examples of the specific neurotransmitters that fall into each category. I know this is a lot to take in, so just look over this table a few times and get familiar with it. Okay, acetylcholine was actually the first neurotransmitter that was ever discovered. We know that widespread loss of cholinergic neurons is present in things like Alzheimer's disease. So cholinergic systems are crucial for learning and memory. There are two major types of receptors that acetylcholine binds to. The first is nicotinic receptors, and this has excitatory effects. It triggers rapid neural and neuromuscular transmission. The other type is muscarinic receptors. This mediates functions of the parasympathetic nervous system. And just an FYI, in an emergent situation when a patient has a case of bradycardia or their heart is beating too slowly, doctors give a dose of atropine, which blocks muscarinic receptors. This helps to speed up the heart rate. It's an anticholinergic drug. Interestingly, when atropine is given, it can induce things like drowsiness and confusion in the patient, but that's kind of a side note. The next major neurotransmitter is dopamine. Dopamine is involved in reinforcement and reward. So rewarding things like sex, drugs, gambling, they all stimulate dopaminergic reward pathways in the brain. And sometimes this can lead to maladaptive conditions such as addiction and gambling. There are two major pathways here. The first is the mesostriatal pathway, which originates in the substantia nigra and terminates in the striatum. The other is the mesolimbocortical pathway, which originates in the ventral tegmental area and terminates in the limbic system of the brain. Dopamine is also very involved in things like movement. With Parkinson's disease, there's a critical destruction of the substantia nigra, which is the major dopamine-producing system in the brain. So Parkinson's is related to not having enough dopamine in the brain. Interestingly, on the other end of the spectrum, when you have too much dopamine in the brain, that's when you see patients diagnosed with schizophrenia. So it's really an interesting dynamic between different levels of dopamine in the brain, healthy levels versus too few with Parkinson's and too much with schizophrenia. Next is norepinephrine or noradrenaline. This is mainly produced in the locus coeruleus, which is in the brainstem. This is the main neurotransmitter in the sympathetic nervous system. There are a bunch of projections of this throughout the brain, so it has some pretty diverse properties, but it's involved in things like mood, arousal, sexual behaviors, among other things, but it's the main neurotransmitter in the sympathetic nervous system. Serotonin is produced in a couple different areas, but notably it's produced in the Raphe nuclei. An interesting fact here is that there's only about 200,000 serotonergic neurons compared to 86 billion that are in the brain. So it's pretty small, but they still have a massive influence throughout the brain. Serotonin is involved in things like sleep, mood, and anxiety. Drugs on the market that increase serotonin activity are known as antidepressants. It's always a balance with all neurotransmitters, and an example of this is serotonin syndrome, which is when there's too much serotonin released in the brain, often as a result of a drug or medication. And this can lead to muscle rigidity, fevers, sometimes seizures, and can be fatal if not taken care of medically. The last two are glutamate and GABA. Glutamate is the main excitatory neurotransmitter. Along with this, it's also involved in things like learning and memory. Sometimes, adversely, in response to strokes or brain traumas, there can be an excessive release of glutamate. This is called excitotoxicity. This overexcites the cells and can lead to systematic cell death. GABA, on the other hand, is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter. Some GABA agonists or GABA agonistic drugs can actually be tranquilizers like Valium, well, if you take enough of it. Sorry if you guys hear that construction going on outside. They've been doing it all morning. We'll get through the rest of these slides. Okay, so here's a little table that breaks some of these down for you just to review later on. I'm not going to go super into depth about this now, but it's here for you to study. And there's just so much more to neurotransmitters and exogenous drugs. We don't really have a lot of time to cover this in depth because we have a lot to cover in this class. But if you want to learn more about this, it's up to you. I will recommend a good book about, or it's called How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. This is all about psychedelic drugs and its history and research and its effects on the brain. Psychedelics here include things like LSD and psilocybin, which are magic mushrooms. There's actually a lot of cool research with psychedelics recently, so you should definitely check it out.